Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining our webinar. My name is Erfi. I'm from Cloudflare Marketing. I'm going to wait a few more minutes. Meanwhile, while we're waiting, I'm going to do some pre-flight checks. As per the announcement before, do let us know if there are any issues with the audio or if you can't see the slides. And we'll do our best to answer questions, which you can just post out throughout the entire webinar. And if all checks out, we can start the webinar in like a few more minutes. So we're just gonna wait a bit more so that more people can join in. Cool. I hope you can hear me, and if there's any issues, just feel free to comment as we go along and just post as many questions as you like. So let's begin. Today we have two distinguished speakers, Anand from Cloudflare and Nate from Catchpoint, and they're going to be introducing themselves. So let's start with you, Nate. Tell us who you are and what you do.
Hello everyone, I'm Nityanand Mehta. I'm Director of Technical Services at Catchpoint. I've been in this industry for about 10 years. I have worked with over 2,500 to 3,000 customers across the globe, helping them manage their digital experience. I'm really excited to be talking with Anand about the industry challenges related to performance today.
Hi, my name is Anand. I'm a solutions engineer here at Cloudflare Singapore. I've been doing CDN performance stuff for over half a decade now. It's an exciting time for us to collaborate with Catchpoint, a good time during the Black Friday deals and like a lot of stuff happening in the e-commerce industry and performance. So looking forward to the webinar.
Cool, thank you guys. So this is a general overview of what we'll be going through throughout this webinar. I'm going to start with the industry landscape, talk about the challenges as well as solutions along with them, and then sum it all up with the best practices that you can take away from in this webinar. Again, feel free to post any questions that you have throughout this webinar. So we're going to get the ball rolling by asking one simple question, which is also part of this whole webinar. Why is performance so important? We have some testimonials from companies talking about how performance has been impacting their businesses. Companies like Pixel talking about they have a massive drop rate in mobile players in on their network because their load times are over a minute long. Even up to a newspaper site from a university talking about having an increase in page views just because the website is faster. So this is really interesting to talk about because how performance impacts their businesses, and in other words, what we can talk about here is actually revenue. And I'm going to pass it on to Nate to talk about how performance and revenue has a relationship in terms of their business, impacts on their businesses. Nate?
Definitely, that's a good, yeah, absolutely. So one important thing that we've observed time and again over the last 10, 15 years is the role that performance has played on revenue, right? And we've seen the importance of tracking performance, and there are probably 4 key business metrics that we help companies track on a daily basis, and some of those are like the conversion rate, bounce rate, page views, and revenue, and all of this is obviously in link with each other, but one common factor that can impact all these 4 key business metrics is performance, right? And the screenshot that you see there is an example of a real customer scenario. This happened last month, where they had a problem with one of their third-party contents on the page, and they also had a problem with some contents which were not really optimized, which resulted in drop in performance. So the leftmost column that you see there, where we see drop in page views, drop in revenue, and also drop in conversion rate when compared to the same day but 3 prior weeks, highlights the impact that performance can have on revenue, right? And proactively monitoring this and diagnosing and resolving the problems as soon as possible, and also proactive measures to optimize performance is really important, because, like I said, performance has a direct impact on revenue. I think we've seen this over and over again. Companies employ CDNs and a lot of other services, and we've been working with Cloudflare lately a lot, with a lot of customers, and addressing some of these challenges. And I think Anand would be greatly placed to talk about that.
Thanks. Cool. That's really interesting about how the industry landscape looks like. So before we go on to our challenges, I'm going to run through with you the 5 points that we're talking about. And we'll start off with bloating web pages. To get started, Nils, could you explain to us why web pages are getting heavier?
Yep, absolutely. Right. So what we've seen again is performance impacts revenue. But what really impacts performance are those 5 challenges that you listed there. And one of the very first things is the bloating web pages, right? Which is the size of the overall web page is increasing, which is a trend that has been steadily increasing over the last few years. There are heavy interactive dynamic contents being added on the page. And we looked at the top 5 Internet Retailer 500 websites. And what we see is a steady trend when we compare 2017 and 18. We see the overall page size for 60% of the websites have increased by 1 to 2 MB. And about 15% of them have become even more heavier by about 2 and 3 MB, right? So there's a very small percentage of websites which really worked on in reducing the content, whether through compression and all other mechanisms. But there is a strong trend of the page size increasing, and that means that you have to have some best practices in place to ensure that you're serving contents as optimally as possible, right? And this is one area where we've closely partnered with Cloudflare in helping customers to ensure that some of our common customers of Cloudflare and Catchpoint, to ensure that they have taken care of all the best practices. And Anand, do you want to talk about how we do this with our customers?
Yep, perfect. So I think Nith was right. So a first big challenge we want to talk about is the huge page sizes, be it images, JavaScript, etc. And one of the simplest and one of the most effective ways of going about it is caching. We have a cheesy CDN joke here, which is cache is king, right? Basically, that's what we at Cloudflare also believe in to some extent. And we've built out a huge network here at Cloudflare. We have close to 155 locations across the world. We serve close to 10% of every HTTP request on the internet. Effectively, what we're doing is we want to push content closest to the end user, or where the eyeball is coming from, right? And we want the ability to serve the content right from that edge location and serve it right from cache, which means as soon as the content, an end user has to fetch the content from its closest location, performance obviously starts improving because of the proximity, network, etc. So caching is one big difference. Now, if we look at the next chart in the slides here, we're looking at how end users can get mapped sometimes suboptimally, and what is the impact of it, right? Here's an example. I think probably Nith can explain this chart better. Nith, what do we see here? Delhi getting mapped to Singapore at the top of the line. What is that doing?
Yeah, this is our Catchpoint's popular CDN mapping dashboard, right? So we spoke about the importance of serving contents from closer to the end users. But how do we ensure that the mapping is always consistent, which is your end users are being mapped to the nearest edge server? Because if it's not, then it deceives the purpose of being on a CDN, right? And this dashboard basically helps you track that, which is, for example, the last row that you see there, where you see Chennai being mapped to Chennai, where the wait time was about 300 milliseconds for a single object, but the very same request, but from Delhi, when it gets mapped to an edge server in Singapore, we see it's taking about 700 milliseconds. So if it's going to take about 400 milliseconds for a single object, then if a page has about 100 objects, we just have to extrapolate the numbers, right? Which goes up to 4, 5, 6 seconds, considering all the parallel downloads and so on, right? So CDNs play a major role by bringing the contents closer to the end user, but it's so important to track it ongoing because the mapping and routing is a very dynamic thing. It's not static. So staying on top of it will help us ensure that implementing the best practices and also ensuring that the best practices implemented are on track 24/7/365.
Cool. So the basic thing is to split our sites, especially cache them on the edge, and that actually delivers the content much quicker because they allow closer to the user itself. Which leads us to our next challenge, which is prevalence of JavaScript. So websites are not only getting bigger, but also more interactive, as I briefly mentioned. Can you explain to us the trend and how they affect user experience and towards performance?
Sure. Before I talk about this, are you folks able to hear me clearly? I think a little bit of your voice is a little choppy there. Can you hear me?
We can hear you well,
Yeah.
yes.
Okay, cool. All right. So yes, we've spoken about the overall impact of bloating web pages, and one of the major components of the bloating web pages and the industry trends is JavaScript. And with the change in technology and the evolving technologies around the web designs, such as React and Angular and single-page applications powered by these technologies, we see a strong trend where it was Angular first, which was literally ruling the market, where a lot of companies were powering their single-page applications, and now we see a trend where the adoption of React.js is growing steadily over the last few years. Now, with these technologies in place, one obvious thing is an increase in the overall JavaScript and the JavaScript size itself, right? Now, these are client-side executing contents, so obviously it has an impact on the browser and, of course, the user experience. And the only way we could ensure that the increase in JavaScript does not impact performance, like in the scenario that Urfi has on the screen, is every time you have a JavaScript on the page which is poorly performing, it has a direct impact on user experience. So the graph basically highlights the time it takes for JavaScripts on the page to load. And at a point where it was slow, we see the speed index, which is basically a very important user experience metric, which talks about at what point the content above the fold for a user has loaded. We see a direct correlation when the performance of JavaScript has slowed down, right? And we see this numerous times where best practices are bypassed. And we have a lot of experience in solving some of these problems for our customers. And Anand, I think we worked on this together for a customer recently, and you want to talk about how we went about in resolving this problem?
Yeah. So we, again here at Cloudflare, realized that one of the big problems is JavaScript. And, recently the State of JavaScript report came out, and, there's just so many different JavaScript versions, each of them impacting performance in their own ways. So we have something called as Rocket Loader. Rocket Loader is our JavaScript optimization product, wherein it effectively prioritizes getting a user content faster to an end user or an eyeball. And how does it do it is it effectively blocks a lot of these JavaScripts until the critical aspects of the page are rendered first. And then the JavaScripts, which are usually, parcel blocking, for people who don't understand how browsers work. Every time a browser encounters a JavaScript, it has to stop all its activities, download the JavaScript, execute it, and then perform a certain action. So effectively, as soon as JavaScripts are encountered, the page construction slows down, which means the overall page speed slows down as well. So moving JavaScript all the way to the bottom of the page until the critical aspects are rendered is what Rocket Loader does. And effectively, in terms of metrics, what it improves is render start time, basically the time at which the first pixel or image appears, basically the way the page appears to load faster for an end user. And here's the example of what I'm talking about, right? The same page, let's say at the end of 5 seconds, loads on both figures, figure 1 and figure 2. But it's the way it loads, basically. So on figure 1, the entire page loads along with the JavaScript advertisement at the end of 5th second, and it's all great. Whereas in figure 2, the same page first loads the most critical aspects of the page, which could be a news article, which could be an e-commerce site, product page. And the JavaScript advertisement gets added by the end of it, which means if you're an end user, you would feel that the page has loaded faster. Well, in fact, it may actually both have loaded at the end of the 5th second, but it's about the perception. And while measuring it, that's exactly what we saw here. We looked at enabling Rocket Loader. What are some of the metrics that it impacted, right? Render start, DOM completion, which is the way the browser builds the page. So Nit, you mentioned how JavaScripts are getting more the prevalence. It's also challenging from a monitoring standpoint, isn't it? What are metrics you want to consider? What should you? What is the one that tells an end user if the page is loading faster, slower? What do you think of that?
Yeah, so one of the most important best practices that we always recommend to our customers is to have only the most business critical JS contents on the top of the page. Everything else that does not play a role in rendering the content quickly has to be deferred or delayed. And if it's important and if it's at the top of the page, what we have to track is it impacting the rendering of the page? 2, is it impacting how soon the user is able to see the contents or interact with the page, right? So render start, DOM interactive, and speed index are probably 3 most popular metrics that the industry currently tracks to ensure that the JavaScripts that are there at the top of the page are not really impacting the user experience.
Interesting. So in my understanding, Rocket Loader bunches up the scripts into one block so as to achieve that perceptible increase in responsiveness.
Yep, that's sort of what it does.
Cool. So next challenge we're going to talk about is, in relation to heavier web pages, images are getting heavier because perhaps users want to have the best quality possible. Let's say, for me, actually, I'm a photographer and I have my own site and I post images. So Nif, could you explain to us this trend and its relation to loading times?
Yep, we spoke about JavaScripts, which is one of the most important ones, and the next most important one, which probably consumes 40 to 30% of any page, are images, which also has been steadily increasing because of the highly interactive websites in the modern web world. But the increase in web pages or images comes at a cost, right? And the screenshot that you see there is an example where this is an example of a customer where they've had a steady increase in images, and this steady increase in images was not really optimized, which resulted in a drop in performance over a period of time, right? We see the yellow line at the top graph talks about how long it takes for the images to load, and every time we see the performance of images has dropped, we see the document complete has also dropped. And similarly, when the image size in the second graph that we see there has dropped, we see the overall performance has dropped, right? So this is a classic example where images that is not really optimized has an impact on performance, and we already spoke about how performance impacts business metrics, right? So there are numerous ways companies adopt to ensure they serve optimized images, and one is the most efficient way is obviously working with the CDN provider to optimize their content. considering you have users coming from different devices and different locations and all of that. And I believe Cloudflare has done a pretty good job, which we hear from a lot of customers, and we also see a lot of data where we see images being optimized to a great extent. And Anand, do you want to talk about how you go about optimizing these images?
Yeah, that's a good point that you bring out. I mean, even in this day and age, in spite of all performance companies talking about optimized image, we still see people putting extremely unoptimized, bulky images, which really don't make sense at all. Because if you're an end user who's using a really small device like a mobile phone, or maybe you're using a tablet, having a 4K image versus like a 720p image actually really makes no difference. Which is what we here at Cloudflare, we have a solution called Polish, right? What it does is it lets web developers or owners the ability to optimize content by just a click of a button. So what it does is, for those who are not familiar with images, every time you take a picture of a certain scenery or whatever, you have a lot of metadata that gets added to an image. Be it, what was the resolution, what is the location where the picture was taken, what is the aperture, focal length, etc. So all of this adds up content, which means as and when there's more bytes added, it starts slowing down a web page. And the ability to strip off this is one of the options that Polish gives, which is our lossless compression. We let the images be optimized in such a way that the image content is not really meddled with, but only the metadata, which is not really relevant if you're browsing through a website. We also give a much more aggressive way of compression, which is a lossy compression. Now, what it does is it strips off some part of the image in itself to the extent that the perceivable quality of the image does not really change. Right, here's a good example of what I'm talking about. The two kangaroo images, for me and you looking on a laptop screen or a smaller screen, they both more or less look exactly the same in terms of the quality. But it's just that one of them is almost twice as efficient as the other in terms of the number of bytes it takes. And that's what lossy compression does. It compresses the image without really altering the perceived quality of it. And WebP, which is basically the new encoding format for images, which more and more browsers are supporting, is something Cloudflare gives you the ability to serve as well. Which means if you have requests coming in from the latest Chrome, and I think Firefox is just about starting to support it, you can serve the images that are encoded in this format. So even if you have a team that's not really conscious about what images you're putting out, just enabling this one feature helps you optimize this to a great extent.
Cool. This works well for me then, since most of my users to my sites are mobile or tablet users. Speaking of which, majority of users I've seen actually are on their mobile devices. So with the prevalence of media sites, this could be a problem due to the instability and speed of mobile connections. So Nif, could you explain to us the trend of mobile device penetration, which is this challenge, and how it's becoming more so?
Yep. So we've seen some of the stats, and we also see this from what our customers say, where they want to monitor more and more of their mobile pages, equal importance as the desktop, right? And the stats kind of validate that, where we see in 2018, 52% of the internet traffic comes from mobile users, right? So this is a solid increase, which is only going to go upwards, where in a lot of regions, especially in the emerging markets, the mobile first users are a lot more, right? So all the best practices that we spoke about, optimizing the full page, images, JavaScripts, are even more critical, because we see a steady increase for mobile users, where their performance, the devices, the network connectivity are highly volatile. Is this what you see as well, Anand, on the CDN side, based on the mobile traffic that you see there?
Yep.
And what do you do about to optimize?
Right. Yeah, I think it's a good point, right? So we've been seeing a lot of e-commerce, e-tailers talking about how people are finally buying on mobile devices also rather than just surfing or browsing through. Either way, having users coming from mobile devices, networks is becoming, the percentage of users are increasing consistently. And which is why, our previous challenge, which was images, now combining that with mobile networks is a big challenge. And that's what we are trying to address with our solution called Mirage. Now, it's mobile optimization for images that Cloudflare provides. So what it does is it delivers the fastest way images based on your devices, and how it does is it reduces all the images, instead of being requested on a singular way, it streamlines all of them into a single request. And what it does is if it identifies that you're coming from a mobile network and a mobile device, it sort of keeps two versions of the same image. One is a lower quality image that gets served right away because you're coming from a mobile device, and such that the page progressively loads and renders. And again, we were talking about perceived performance, and it improves the perceived performance of the web page. And as soon as the critical components and the entire page is loaded, it then switches automatically to the higher resolution or the higher quality image. So, so that way, what it does is it effectively reduces the response times and the page load times as a whole. And that's what you're seeing with this chart here. Nit, can you explain on this chart that we're looking at, and how, clearly Mirage is making a difference, but how is it actually, how would you read this chart?
Yes, we've seen this a lot, right? And this is one of the best ways to evaluate when you an optimization technique or a technology, which is what percentage of my users are benefiting by the optimization. And the best way to address that is this cumulative distribution graph, where the x-axis is the different percentiles and the y is the page load times. So the graph on top talks about what percentage of users, which is are optimized when are experiencing optimized performance with Mirage and without Mirage. Where you see the graph below, you see the time to load images for the first 25 to 30% of the users is almost neck to neck. But as we progress towards the 50, 60, 70, 80, and 90 percentiles of the users, we see the performance is the difference between optimized and non-optimized is poor, because this is basically all those users who are coming from slower connections, hard devices with poor capabilities, and so on, right? And this is basically where we see a lot of difference of optimization playing a role, and that's basically what this chart is all about.
Perfect. I think we've got a few people asking some really interesting questions about Mirage, which we will address as soon as we finish our next challenge. But just to sum up what Nit was saying, right, it's actually quite amazing that even by just enabling one button, you can see even the best performing users or your best end users still seeing an improvement in performance. And again, this is when Mirage detects what device you're coming from, which is obviously a user agent check, along with basically which network you're coming from. If it's a known mobile network, then in that case, it is going to identify and implement Mirage. So that should answer a couple of questions. And if someone also wanted to know if it impacts user experience, not really. We haven't seen any complaints of user experience impacted by Mirage. Awesome. Quickly, let's, I think, move on to our final challenge.
That works perfect for me, actually, since most of my users are mobile users. So we're going to go full circle here. We talked about bloating web pages, increasing interactivity, script-heavy sites, but the content could also be more dynamic. So, Nif, could you explain to us how dynamic content affects performance?
Yep, this is where things can become a little tricky, because there are contents which can be cached, which can be optimized on the edge and served for users from edge servers closer to the user. But where it can get tricky is with content which cannot be cached and which has to be served from the origin servers, and most companies have their origin servers in a few locations across the globe, whereas you probably have users coming from across the world. And we've seen every time the origin content has a problem, even if you have your static content optimized, it leads to poor user experience. And ensuring that the origin content is optimized as much as possible, and ensuring that the users are taken back all the way back to the origin through an optimized network makes a lot of difference, plus all the other optimizations that we spoke about will add value when you have your origin content, mostly the base HTML, business logic scripts, and all of that are requests that goes back all the way back to the origin. And if it's not going through an optimized network, then the performance is going to go for a toss, right? And this is another area where we work closely with Cloudflare to identify and help customers optimize their dynamic, non-cacheable content. And Anand, do you want to talk about how you go about in optimizing all these dynamic contents for your users?
Right. I think it's a very good point, right? So gone are the days where each of us use the internet just to get localized content. I mean, there are times where I buy something on an e-commerce site that's in the United States. We have end users from across the globe accessing sites that are distributed elsewhere. So to address a solution like this, we have Argo Smart Routing. Right now, as the name says, it's smart routing. It's basically dynamic route optimization. Let's say you're an end user who's somewhere in, let's say, Indonesia, and you have trying to fetch a website that has content stored in the origin servers in the East Coast of the United States. So which means if it's dynamic content like personalized pages, your login pages, your dynamic content, the end user in Indonesia has to go all the way to the East Coast of the United States through one CDN server and fetch the content. What Argo does is the longest part of the internet is it's going to optimize this using Cloudflare's advanced network congestion avoidance algorithms that we employ amongst our own POPs. We make sure having the most dynamic route actually makes sure that TCP connections are reused. So what it's doing at the end of the day is it's leading to faster page load times for dynamic content. And how it does is it makes sure it eliminates congested network paths, makes sure unreliable connections are bypassed. And that's what we see with a lot of our customer testimonials about Argo specifically, right? Wherein we have, let's say, Quizlet, which has requests that are coming in from Brazil, and they've seen an improvement of over 50%. Then we have OkCupid, which is a dating site, which saw almost a 36% improvement in performance. And then we here have, again, a catch point chart where we had a customer compare one CDN, their incumbent in CDN versus a Cloudflare with Argo, and they say that they saw almost a 38% global performance increase, which is, again, quite significant because by just enabling one simple feature, you're even optimizing dynamic content and effectively trying to solve the speed of light problem here. And that's what Argo Smart Routing does. It makes sure the longest path of the internet is optimized using Cloudflare's algorithms.
So to sum up the entire webinar, we have some takeaways, best practices, if you say, to take away from this webinar. So Anand, would you like to go through our solutions to the problems that we've been going through this webinar?
Yeah, perfect. I think it's good to summarize some of the challenges and the solutions that we talked about, right? I think Nit and I talked initially about how the pages are getting fatter, more unoptimized, and pages are bloating. And one of the best ways to address that solution is to cache content closer to the end user. Then we talked about JavaScript, how JavaScripts are being so prevalent and how are they impacting performance. And we have Rocket Loader here at Cloudflare that makes sure JavaScripts don't cause significant impact and still give you the functionality. Then we talked about images being unhealthy, images being unoptimized, uncompressed, and we have polish for compression of these images. And with the penetration of mobile devices and mobile data getting expensive and images getting fatter. To solve that problem, we have Mirage, which is our image optimization technique. And finally, for dynamic content, stuff that can't be cached, stuff that can't be compressed, like images, we have Argo Smart Routing, effectively optimizing the longest path of the internet using Cloudflare algorithms. So
cool.
Yeah,
that's a lot of information, but it's super interesting, and I feel like I've learned a lot. So we come to the end of the webinar, but before that, those who came in a bit later, don't worry about it. You can join and watch the webinar again on demand, and we'll have the slides added to this one as well as on SlideShare, which we'll be sending out to all of you. And now we'll proceed to the Q&A session. We have about 10 minutes. We'll try our best to answer as many questions as we can.
Right. I think let's start taking some of the questions we had from earlier in the presentation. This first one is, can I speed up my URL shortening site using Cloudflare? So the answer is yes. I would suspect URL shortening would be dynamic. The request has to go all the way to the origin for it to apply some logic. And yeah, you can use Argo Smart Routing. And actually, funnily, that actually gives me an idea where we have Cloudflare workers at the moment, which is basically a JavaScript at the edge. So now, if you have logic that can be implemented using JavaScript, well, we are looking at serverless at the moment. You can do your URL shortening right at the Cloudflare edge. And yes, the short answer, yes. Long answer, yes, even faster with workers. The next question we have is, can Cloudflare integrate with content servers, resource servers for the right images instead of optimization? I'm not really sure what you mean by can it fetch the right image, but what Cloudflare can do is fetch content from different types of origin servers, in this case, content servers, resource servers, if they're accessible. Now, if there are query strings paths that can have logic, or if there are request parameters that help Cloudflare identify which content to fetch from where, yes, we can do that.
There's a few of you talking about audio issues and the webinar being static. Are you able to hear us now? If you're not able to hear, I guess you can't hear it.
Nick, there's one question for you here. Someone was talking about how do you identify, which is a metric to help identify user performance? Is there one single metric?
It depends on the nature of the website. So if you've got contents where, for example, you have carousels on the page, then some custom metrics are really useful, where you could add timers. If there are no carousels or moving parts on the page, then speed index or visually complete basically gives you a good picture of the user experience. But like I said, if you've got dynamic content, things changing, then it's always good to have some custom timers on the page and then tracking those events as users navigate from one page to another. And the beauty of the custom timers is you can track this not just through synthetic monitoring, but also through real users. So you could correlate one with synthetic, you can diagnose, and through RUM, you can also look at real user monitoring. You can look at the impact it has on real users and so on. So that basically is what we see in the industry and what we recommend as well.
No, again, I have another question for you. Again, this is a question from my end. It's not really from an audience member. We've talked about, performance, some of the solutions we talked here. And right now, this week is the Black Friday, Cyber Monday deals. And I'm sure Cloudflare is working, Catchpoint is working with a lot of e-commerce customers to monitor their performance. Do you see some of these best practices being implemented at the moment?
Oh yes, absolutely, right. So we've seen websites where some of these best practices are religiously followed by organizations who have a pretty good trend over the last 2 weeks. So we've come up with this new program where we are tracking the performance of our customers over the last 2 weeks, and we'll see through until the end of the month. It's a special program just for this Black Friday, but what we've seen with hundreds of our customers is when you have these best practices in place, there is some stability in performance, right? When things break, things break. But then ensuring that there is stability and consistency can only be accomplished when the best practices are in place. And we see that with websites are consistent, and where these best practices are bypassed or skipped, we see the impact. Like in a recent example, when the whole Google outage that happened early last week, where Google APIs was not reachable, and when a lot of companies were relying just purely on them and not some best practices were skipped, we saw that the users were staring at blank pages for 30 seconds and 40 seconds. So we see a good trend, and best practices always come as a savior.
Fantastic. We have another question here about caching. So someone was asking, what is the best caching strategy? Well, that's a very interesting question, because the answer is a very bad, it totally depends. But at its best case, it can be cache everything or sometimes cache conditionally. Now, what I'm saying is, let's say you have a site that's not really dynamic, but something that you want to generate on a time-to-time basis. You can use conditional caching, maybe cache for 30 seconds, refresh it every end of 30 seconds. Or, unless some content is really personalized or really dynamic, always look at caching it or serving from the edge. Or again, at the moment, we hear Cloudflare talk about Cloudflare workers quite a bit, which means you can even generate content at the edge, build custom responses, and serve out to your end users. So, effectively, again, trying to keep content as close to the end user as possible.
So let's just answer one last question before we finish it off.
Right. I think we have one question, which is, I use a lot of plugins for my WordPress sites, and most plugins have unminified JavaScript. Can I solve this using Cloudflare? It's an interesting question. Can you identify, or can you solve third-party scripts on your page? Now, this is where Rocket Loader comes in. Right now, if a lot of these unminified JavaScripts firstly are being triggered from your base page, which is the domain you can control, then as we discussed, Rocket Loader pushes down all these unoptimized JavaScript right at the bottom of the page, so that the critical aspects of your page, which is your content, actually gets prioritized, and your end users can see that. Now, again, I think Nit can go on hours together about the impact of third-party content here, but because you can't control it, one of the best ways to do it is Rocket Loader, because you control your base page. So make sure don't put too many third-party content. Yeah, Nit.
Yeah, just want to jump in there, right? So some of these plugins allow you to self-host them. So rather than requesting those plugins from the third-party providers, who are probably not as optimized based on your global audience, it's always good to self-host these, so that way you have control over these contents, and then just like all your own content, you could serve it through Cloudflare. That way you have control over these third-party plugins, right? So all those that allow you, like Google APIs or A/B testing tools or anything else, fonts and a few others, all of that can be self-hosted. So that way you have control.
Cool. Thanks, Anand. Thanks, Nit, for having this very educational webinar. For those who are joining late again, and those who have been having issues, this is recorded and you can watch on demand, and slides will be added on SlideShare as well as on BrightTalk itself, so you can watch it and go through the slides again. Thank you for joining, and we'll end the presentation now.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks, Nit.
Thank you, everyone.